They all assumed he was just another airport worker, grateful for steady employment. Someone who'd probably never even been on a plane. But the tattoo on Jake Williams's arm told a different story. One of aerial combat, impossible missions, and a fall from grace so complete that a decorated fighter pilot had ended up cleaning the floors of the airport he once called home. The question wasn't how he got the tattoo. The question was how a man who used to rule the skies ended up forgotten on the ground. Welcome to Daily Soldier Stories. Before we continue this incredible story of hidden identity and second chances, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today? And if you believe every hero deserves to be seen, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. Dallas International Airport never slept, and neither did Jake Williams. Every morning at 4:30 a.m., he clocked in at the maintenance office, retrieved his cart from storage, and began the methodical process of cleaning one of America's busiest airports before the first wave of passengers arrived. Terminal C, gates 15 through 28. That was his domain. 13 gates where millions of travelers pass through every year, rushing toward destinations they took for granted. Jake mopped their spilled coffee, emptied their discarded newspapers, and cleaned the bathrooms they used without thinking. He wore the same uniform every day, navy blue coveralls with maintenance embroidered on the chest, steel-toed boots that had seen better years, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. To the pilots, flight attendants, and gate agents who passed him daily, he was part of the infrastructure, essential but invisible, necessary but unremarkable. None of them knew that Jake Williams had once been Captain Jake Williams, United States Air Force. None of them suspected that the man pushing a mop through Terminal C had logged over 3,000 flight hours in F-16 Fighting Falcons. They couldn't imagine that their quiet janitor had flown combat missions over Iraq and Afghanistan, providing close air support for ground troops under fire. They saw what they expected to see, a middle-aged man grateful for steady work. They missed what was actually there, a pilot who had fallen from the sky and never quite figured out how to get back up. Jake had been working at Dallas International for 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days, not because he needed the money. His military disability pension covered his basic expenses. He worked there because airports were the only places where he felt connected to the life he used to live. The sound of jet engines, the smell of aviation fuel, the controlled chaos of flight operations, it was the closest he could get to the world that had once defined him. Every morning, he watched commercial pilots walk past in their pressed uniforms, rolling their flight bags with the confident stride of men who belonged in cockpits. Some were younger than him, fresh-faced aviators who'd learned to fly in civilian flight schools. Others were military veterans like himself, though they'd managed to make the transition to commercial aviation that had eluded him. Jake never approached them, never struck up conversations about flying or shared war stories from his combat deployments. He just cleaned around them, invisible and silent, carrying the weight of his past like a stone in his chest. The pilots occasionally nodded when they passed him, the polite acknowledgement that well-mannered people give to service workers. A few had learned his first name over the years and would say, "Morning, Jake," as they hurried toward their gates. But none had ever asked about his background, his story, or how he'd ended up mopping floors at an airport, which was exactly how Jake preferred it. Jake Williams had been born to fly. As a child growing up in small-town Texas, he'd built model airplanes and dreamed of soaring above the clouds. In high school, he'd joined the Civil Air Patrol and earned his private pilot's license before he could legally drive. When he turned 18, the Air Force Academy was his only choice for college. He graduated third in his class and was selected for fighter pilot training. The F-16 became his aircraft, aerial combat became his specialty, and the sky became his office. For 12 years, Captain Jake Williams was everything the Air Force wanted in a pilot: skilled, dedicated, fearless, and absolutely committed to the mission. He flew 2 combat deployments to Iraq and 1 to Afghanistan, close air support missions where ground troops depended on his precision and courage, deep strike missions behind enemy lines where split-second decisions meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Combat air patrols, where he protected American forces from aerial threats that never materialized but always could. His service record was exemplary. Distinguished Flying Cross for valor in combat, Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, Aerial Achievement Medal, the kind of decorations that marked a pilot destined for higher command, maybe even general stars someday. Then came the mission that changed everything. March 15, 2019. A routine close air support mission over Afghanistan. American ground forces pinned down by enemy fire, requesting immediate air support. Jake and his wingman responded, diving through clouds to provide covering fire for the evacuation of wounded soldiers. The first pass went perfectly. Enemy positions neutralized, friendly forces extracted safely. But as Jake climbed for his second attack run, something went wrong. Not with his aircraft. The F-16 performed flawlessly. The problem was with the intelligence. The coordinates he'd been given were wrong. The target he'd been ordered to strike wasn't an enemy position. It was a school. Empty, thankfully, because classes had been canceled due to the fighting. But still a school. Still a civilian building in a village where children learn to read and dream of better futures. The mistake wasn't Jake's fault. The intelligence failure belonged to someone else, some analyst thousands of miles away who had mixed up grid coordinates. But fault didn't matter when Jake saw the rubble where a school had stood. Fault didn't matter when he realized what his precision-guided munitions had destroyed. The investigation cleared him of any wrongdoing. The Air Force officially determined that Captain Williams had followed orders and executed his mission parameters perfectly. There would be no court-martial, no disciplinary action, no black mark on his service record. But Jake couldn't clear himself. Every time he climbed into a cockpit, he saw that school. Every time he lined up a target, he wondered if the coordinates were wrong again. Every time he squeezed the trigger, his hands shook just enough to throw off his aim. Flight surgeons called it combat stress reaction. His squadron commander called it temporary. The base chaplain called it a crisis of faith. Jake called it the end of his flying career. He requested grounding from flight status. The Air Force tried counseling, psychiatric evaluation, even a desk job at the Pentagon. But Jake couldn't get back in the cockpit. The thing that had defined his entire adult life, the ability to fly and fight, was gone. He submitted his resignation after 14 years of service, 2 years short of retirement. The Air Force processed it with regret but understanding. Captain Jake Williams, decorated combat pilot, became Mr. Jake Williams, unemployed veteran. That was 3 years ago. Captain Lisa Chen had been flying commercially for United Airlines for 5 years, but she still felt like the new kid at Dallas International. Former Navy pilot, FA-18 Super Hornet, 2 combat deployments to the Persian Gulf. She'd made the transition from military to commercial aviation smoother than most, though she sometimes missed the adrenaline of carrier landings and the camaraderie of squadron life. This Tuesday morning was typical. Early departure to Denver, routine flight plan, clear weather. She arrived at gate 22 40 minutes before departure, rolling her flight bag through Terminal C with the efficient pace of someone who'd walked these corridors hundreds of times. That's when she noticed the spill. Someone had dropped a large coffee near the gate entrance, and the dark liquid was spreading across the polished floor, a safety hazard and a mess that needed immediate attention. Lisa looked around for airport maintenance, knowing they were usually quick to respond to spills in high-traffic areas. She spotted the janitor immediately. Middle-aged man, navy coveralls, pushing his cart toward the mess with methodical purpose. She'd seen him before. Most pilots who flew regularly out Dallas International recognized the maintenance staff, even if they didn't know their names. "Excuse me," Lisa called out as he approached. "Looks like someone had an accident with their coffee." The janitor looked up briefly, nodded, and began setting up his cleaning supplies. "I'll take care of it, ma'am. Sorry for the inconvenience." His voice carried a precision that caught Lisa's attention, not the casual speech of someone doing manual labor, but the crisp articulation of someone accustomed to clear communication. Military bearing, she thought automatically. As the janitor knelt to clean the spill, his sleeves rode up slightly, revealing his forearms. That's when Lisa saw it. the tattoo that made her freeze mid-step. Wings. Not commercial airline wings or the stylized designs people got at tattoo parlors. These were U.S. Air Force pilot wings, perfectly rendered in black ink on weathered skin. The kind of tattoo that only real pilots got, usually after earning their wings or completing a significant milestone. But there was more. Surrounding the wings were other military tattoos that told a story Lisa could read like a service record. Combat ribbons rendered in miniature detail, the outline of an F-16 Fighting Falcon, hash marks indicating deployments, the kind of body art that belonged to someone who'd spent years in cockpits, not cleaning floors. Lisa stared, her mind racing. This wasn't some wannabe pilot with fake tattoos from a strip mall parlor. This was the real thing. A legitimate military aviator working as airport maintenance. The janitor finished cleaning the spill and began packing his supplies. As he stood, Lisa caught a clearer view of the wing tattoo and noticed something else, the precise way he moved, the unconscious habit of scanning his surroundings, the perfect posture even while performing menial labor. "Excuse me," Lisa said, her voice carefully neutral. "That's a nice tattoo, Air Force." The janitor's hand stilled for just a moment. He looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time, and Lisa saw something there that confirmed her suspicions. Not just intelligence, but the particular kind of alertness that came from flying high-performance aircraft in dangerous situations. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "Long time ago." "Fighter pilot?" Another pause. F-16s. I was Captain Jake Williams, 421st Fighter Squadron. Lisa felt her breath catch. The 421st was legendary in Air Force circles, an elite unit that had seen action in every major conflict since the 1990s. If this man had flown with the 421st, he wasn't just any pilot. He was one of the best. "Captain Lisa Chen, former Navy, FA-18s off the Stennis." She offered her hand, and Jake shook it with the firm grip of someone accustomed to formal introductions. "Pleasure to meet you, Captain," Jake said, then immediately began pushing his cart away. "Wait," Lisa called after him. "I don't understand. If you were a fighter pilot, what are you doing?" She gestured at the cleaning supplies. Jake stopped but didn't turn around. "Different life now, ma'am. If you'll excuse me, I have work to finish." He continued down the corridor, leaving Lisa standing by gate 22 with more questions than answers and the unsettling realization that she'd just met a decorated combat pilot who was mopping floors for minimum wage. Lisa Chen couldn't concentrate on her pre-flight checklist. The encounter with Jake Williams had shaken something loose in her mind, a nagging sense that she'd witnessed something important that she didn't fully understand. During the flight to Denver, she found herself thinking about the janitor's tattoos, his military bearing, the way he'd carried himself despite the humble nature of his work. She'd known dozens of military pilots who'd transitioned to commercial aviation after their service ended. Some struggled with the adjustment, but they found ways to keep flying. They didn't end up pushing mop carts through airports. That evening, back in her Dallas apartment, Lisa did something she'd never done before. She researched a stranger on the internet, Captain Jake Williams, 421st Fighter Squadron, United States Air Force. She expected to find very little. Military personnel records weren't typically public information. What she found instead made her understand why Jake Williams was cleaning floors instead of flying planes. The first article was from Air Force Times, dated 3 years ago. Decorated fighter pilot resigns following Afghanistan incident. The piece was brief and carefully worded, the kind of military journalism that conveyed facts without context. Captain Jake Williams, a 12-year veteran with multiple combat deployments, had submitted his resignation following an unspecified incident during a close air support mission in Afghanistan. The article mentioned that Williams had been cleared of any wrongdoing, but had requested reassignment to non-flying duties before ultimately leaving the service. Lisa found more details in defense industry publications and military blogs. The incident involved a targeting error. Williams had been given incorrect coordinates and had struck a civilian building instead of the intended enemy position. No one had been killed, the building had been empty, but the mistake had reportedly affected Williams so profoundly that he'd never flown combat missions again. The more Lisa read, the clearer the picture became. Jake Williams hadn't been drummed out of the Air Force in disgrace. He hadn't been court-martialed or punished. He'd been a victim of the fog of war, the kind of tragic mistake that happened in combat zones, despite everyone's best efforts to avoid civilian casualties. But knowing that didn't seem to have helped Jake Williams forgive himself. Lisa found one more article, this one from a military mental health website. The Hidden Cost of Precision: How Combat Stress Affects Elite Pilots. It didn't mention Jake by name, but it described exactly the kind of psychological injury that could end a flying career overnight. Elite pilots were trained to be perfect. Their entire identity was built around precision, control, and the ability to deliver ordnance exactly where it was supposed to go. When that precision failed, even through no fault of their own, the psychological damage could be more devastating than the physical wounds. The article described pilots who couldn't return to cockpits after making targeting errors, even when they'd been officially cleared of wrongdoing. Their inability to fly wasn't about fear or cowardice. It was about the destruction of the fundamental belief system that made combat flying possible. Lisa closed her laptop and sat in her living room, staring out at the Dallas skyline. Somewhere in this city was a decorated combat pilot who was so broken by guilt and self-doubt that he'd chosen to clean airports rather than fly airplanes. And tomorrow morning, she'd see him again at Gate 22, invisible to everyone who mattered, carrying the weight of his fall from grace like a cross he couldn't put down. She made a decision that would change both their lives. The next morning, Lisa arrived at Terminal C an hour before her scheduled departure. She'd traded shifts with another pilot to ensure she'd be working out of Dallas International, and she'd brought something with her, a thermos of coffee and a plan she wasn't entirely sure was wise. She found Jake exactly where she expected to find him, methodically cleaning the gate areas in the pre-dawn quiet, before the first wave of passengers arrived. He was working alone, as always, invisible in his Navy coveralls and baseball cap. "Mr. Williams?" Lisa called out as she approached. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Jake looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Captain Chen, you're here early." "I brought coffee," Lisa said, holding up the thermos. "Thought maybe we could talk." Jake's expression became guarded. "I appreciate the gesture, ma'am, but I'm on duty. Can't really take breaks during operational hours." "5 minutes," Lisa pressed. "There's something I need to say." Jake studied her face, perhaps recognizing the determination that had gotten her through Navy flight training. Finally, he nodded and gestured toward a quiet seating area near Gate 20. They sat across from each other in the empty waiting area, surrounded by the institutional furniture and muted lighting of an airport before dawn. Lisa poured coffee into 2 paper cups and handed one to Jake, who accepted it with obvious reluctance. "I looked you up," Lisa said without preamble. "The 421st Fighter Squadron, Afghanistan, the targeting error." Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. "I read about what happened," Lisa continued. "Wrong coordinates, empty school, no casualties. Investigation cleared you of any wrongdoing." "That's right," Jake said quietly. "Ancient history now." "Is it?" Lisa leaned forward. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like ancient history is running your life. You're one of the most qualified pilots in America, and you're mopping floors." Jake set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Captain Chen, I appreciate whatever it is you think you're trying to do here. But you don't know me, and you don't know what happened over there." "I know enough," Lisa replied. "I know that combat pilots make split-second decisions with incomplete information. I know that sometimes intelligence is wrong. I know that good people get hurt by mistakes that aren't their fault." "You don't know what it's like to see a building disappear because you pulled the trigger," Jake said, his voice carrying an edge Lisa hadn't heard before. "You're right, I don't. But I know what it's like to carry guilt for things beyond your control. I lost a wingman over Syria because I followed the wrong vector, sent him into a surface-to-air missile envelope that intelligence told me was clear. He ejected, got picked up by friendly forces, but his aircraft was destroyed because I made a navigation error." Jake looked at her with new attention. "The difference between us," Lisa continued, "is that I learned to forgive myself. You're still punishing yourself for being human." I'm not punishing myself, Jake said. I'm accepting reality. I can't fly combat missions anymore. Every time I line up a target, I see that school. My hands shake. My concentration breaks. I'm a liability in a cockpit. Combat missions, maybe. But there are other ways to fly. Jake shook his head. I tried commercial aviation, applied to every major airline, passed all the tests, even got a few interviews. But the moment they ask about why I left the Air Force, the moment they hear about the targeting error, it's over. Airlines don't want pilots with psychological baggage. Some do, Lisa said. The right ones do. Airlines that understand that combat experience, even difficult combat experience, makes pilots better, not worse. She reached into her flight bag and pulled out a business card. My squadron commander at United, former Air Force, flew F-15s in Iraq. He specifically recruits military pilots who've had challenging transitions, says they make the most careful, most conscientious commercial aviators he's ever worked with. Jake looked at the business card but didn't take it. Captain Chen, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I've accepted my situation. I have work that pays the bills. I'm around aircraft even if I'm not flying them. It's enough. Is it? Lisa asked. Because every morning I see you watching the pilots walk past, and you look like a man dying of thirst watching other people drink water. The observation hit Jake like a physical blow. His careful composure cracked slightly, revealing the pain he'd been carrying for 3 years. Some things can't be fixed, he said quietly. Some things can't, Lisa agreed. But some things can. The question is whether you're brave enough to try. She placed the business card on the small table between them and stood up. His name is Captain Mike Rodriguez. Tell him Lisa Chen gave you his contact information. Tell him your story, all of it, including what happened in Afghanistan. Let him decide whether you're still pilot material. Jake stared at the business card as Lisa walked away. For the first time in 3 years, he wondered if the sky was still waiting for him. Jake Williams carried Captain Rodriguez's business card in his wallet for 2 weeks without calling. Every morning, he'd retrieve it while getting dressed for work, stare at it for a few moments, then put it back. Every evening, he'd take it out again, sometimes even reaching for his phone before changing his mind. The card represented possibility, but it also represented risk. As long as he didn't make the call, he could preserve the fantasy that maybe, someday, he might fly again. Making the call meant facing the possibility of final rejection, of having the last door to aviation closed forever. During those 2 weeks, Jake found himself paying closer attention to the pilots who passed through his terminal. He noticed details he'd trained himself to ignore, the confident way they carried themselves, the casual conversations about weather patterns and flight plans, the easy camaraderie that came from sharing a profession that only a few thousand people truly understood. Captain Chen had been right about one thing. Watching other people fly while he mopped floors was its own form of torture. The decision came suddenly, triggered by a routine interaction that shattered his carefully maintained emotional barriers. It was a Thursday morning, early shift, when Jake noticed a commotion near Gate 24. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, was crying while her parents tried to comfort her. From the fragments of conversation Jake overheard, he gathered that she was terrified of flying, her first airplane trip, visiting grandparents in Chicago. The gate agent was doing her best to reassure the family, but the child's fear was escalating. Other passengers were beginning to stare, and Jake could see the parents' embarrassment growing along with their daughter's anxiety. Without thinking about it, Jake approached the family. "Excuse me," he said to the parents. "I couldn't help but notice your daughter is nervous about flying. Mind if I talk to her?" The parents looked at his maintenance uniform with obvious skepticism, but something in Jake's demeanor, the quiet authority that had never quite left him, made them nod. Jake knelt down to the girl's eye level. "Hi there, what's your name?" "Emma," the girl sniffled. "Hi, Emma, I'm Jake. I heard you're worried about getting on the airplane." Emma nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Can I tell you a secret?" Jake said conspiratorially. "I used to fly airplanes, lots of them. And I can promise you something. The pilots who are going to take you to Chicago are some of the best in the world. They've practiced flying so many times that they could probably do it with their eyes closed." Really? Emma asked, her crying beginning to subside. Really. And here's another secret. Airplanes are actually safer than cars. The pilots spend hours before every flight checking everything, making sure the airplane is perfect. They talk to air traffic controllers who help guide them through the sky like crossing guards help kids cross the street. Jake continued talking to Emma for 10 minutes, explaining how airplanes worked, describing the feeling of takeoff, painting a picture of flight that was magical rather than terrifying. By the time boarding began, Emma was excited rather than afraid, asking her parents if she could sit by the window to watch the clouds. As the family headed toward the gate, Emma's father stopped and turned back to Jake. "Thank you," he said simply. "I don't know what you said, but you saved our entire vacation." After they boarded, Jake stood alone in the gate area, watching through the windows as the aircraft pushed back from the jet bridge. The captain at the controls had no idea that his passengers included a little girl who was no longer afraid to fly, thanks to a janitor who remembered what it felt like to love aviation. That evening, Jake went home to his small apartment, took Captain Rodriguez's business card out of his wallet, and dialed the number. Captain Mike Rodriguez had been expecting Jake's call. Lisa Chen had briefed him thoroughly on the situation. Decorated combat pilot, targeting error in Afghanistan, psychological grounding, 3 years working airport maintenance. Rodriguez had seen similar cases before, though few as extreme as Jake Williams's fall from grace. They arranged to meet at Rodriguez's office at United's Flight Operations Center, not for a formal interview, but for what Rodriguez called a conversation between pilots. Jake took a personal day from his maintenance job and showed up wearing the only civilian clothes he owned that looked professional: khakis and a button-down shirt he'd bought for job interviews 3 years earlier. Rodriguez was in his 50s, graying at the temples, with the relaxed confidence of someone who'd successfully transitioned from military to commercial aviation. His office walls were covered with photographs from his Air Force days: F-15 Eagles, squadron patches, group photos of pilots in flight suits. "Lisa tells me you're pushing a mop cart at Dallas International," Rodriguez said after they'd exchanged introductions. "That's gotta be killing you." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "It pays the bills." "I'm sure it does. But that's not why you're working at an airport, is it? You're there because you can't stay away from airplanes, even if you can't fly them." The observation was so accurate that Jake couldn't deny it. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. "Tell me about Afghanistan. The real story, not the sanitized version from the investigation report." For the next hour, Jake told the story he'd never told anyone. Not just the facts of the targeting error, but the emotional aftermath, the nightmares, the guilt, the way his hands shook when he tried to line up weapon systems, the progressive loss of confidence that had made him a danger to himself and his wingmen. Rodriguez listened without interruption, occasionally nodding with the understanding of someone who'd faced his own demons in combat zones. "Have you been to counseling?" Rodriguez asked when Jake finished. "Military psychiatrists, civilian therapists, even tried a support group for combat veterans. Nothing helped. What about flight training? Have you been up in an aircraft since you left the Air Force?" Jake shook his head. "Can't afford it, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to know if I've lost the ability to fly completely." Rodriguez studied him for a moment. "Here's what I think happened to you, Jake. You were an elite fighter pilot whose entire identity was built around perfection. When you made a mistake, even a mistake caused by faulty intelligence, your brain decided that you were no longer capable of the precision that combat flying requires. That's probably accurate. But commercial flying isn't combat flying. There's no one shooting at you, no split-second targeting decisions, no life or death consequences for every choice you make. It's about safety, procedure, and the kind of careful decision-making that your experience has actually made you better at, not worse." Rodriguez pulled out a folder from his desk drawer. "I've got your military service record here. 12 years, multiple combat deployments, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal with clusters. The only negative mark is the incident that ended your career, and even that shows you following proper procedures with faulty intelligence." He leaned forward. "Jake, I've been recruiting military pilots for commercial aviation for 8 years. I've seen guys with perfect service records who couldn't handle the transition, because they'd never faced real adversity. I've also seen guys who'd been through hell and came out stronger because of it. Which category do I fall into? That depends on whether you're willing to find out if you can still fly. Rodriguez opened his desk drawer and pulled out a set of keys. I've got a Cessna 172 at a training facility about 30 minutes from here. If you're serious about getting back in the air, we're going to take a discovery flight. Just you, me, and a simple aircraft to see if the magic is still there. Jake stared at the keys, feeling a mixture of terror and anticipation he hadn't experienced in 3 years. And if I freeze up? If I can't handle it? Then we'll land the airplane and you'll go back to mopping floors. But if you can handle it, if even a small part of your flying ability is still intact, then we'll talk about getting you into United's training program. Jake reached for the keys with hands that were trembling slightly. Not from fear this time, but from the possibility that he might be about to reclaim the thing he'd lost. The Cessna 172 sat on the ramp at Addison Airport like a patient teacher waiting for a nervous student. Jake hadn't been inside an aircraft cockpit in 3 years, and the familiar smell of aviation fuel and worn leather brought back memories he'd tried to suppress. Captain Rodriguez completed the pre-flight inspection while Jake stood beside the aircraft, running his hands along the wing struts and control surfaces with the unconscious familiarity of someone who'd spent half his life around airplanes. "When's the last time you flew a single-engine aircraft?" Rodriguez asked as they prepared to board. "Flight training, probably 15 years ago. Everything since then has been jets." "This'll be different then, more forgiving, but also more demanding in some ways. You have to actually fly this airplane instead of managing computer systems." They climbed into the cramped cockpit, Jake in the left seat, Rodriguez in the right. The instrument panel was almost laughably simple compared to the sophisticated displays Jake remembered from F-16 cockpits. But the basic layout was familiar. Attitude indicator, airspeed, altimeter, the fundamental instruments that had guided aviators for decades. "Take your time," Rodriguez said as Jake scanned the cockpit. "We're not going anywhere until you're ready." Jake's hands moved over the controls with muscle memory that had survived 3 years of disuse. Mixture, propeller, throttle, master switch, ignition, fuel pumps. The systematic checks that every pilot learned, repeated so many times they became automatic. "Clear prop," Jake called out, then engaged the starter. The Lycoming engine caught immediately, settling into the familiar rhythm that meant life and possibility. Ground control cleared them to taxi to runway 15, and Jake applied power carefully, feeling the aircraft respond to his inputs. The sensation of controlling an airplane again, even one moving slowly on the ground, sent electricity through his nervous system. "How are you feeling?" Rodriguez asked as they reached the run-up area. "Nervous," Jake admitted, "but good nervous, if that makes sense." They completed the engine checks, tested the flight controls, verified that all systems were operating normally. Finally, there was nothing left to do but fly. Addison Tower, Cessna 739, Delta Foxtrot, ready for departure, Jake radioed. Cessna 39 Delta Foxtrot, cleared for takeoff runway 15, left turn approved. Jake aligned the aircraft with the runway centerline and advanced the throttle. The Cessna accelerated slowly, gaining speed as the propeller pulled them forward. At 65 knots, Jake eased back on the yoke, and the aircraft lifted off the ground with the gentle grace of a bird finding its wings. For a moment, Jake felt nothing but pure joy. The earth fell away beneath them, Dallas sprawled out in all directions, and he was flying again. 3 years of guilt and self-doubt evaporated in the simple miracle of sustained flight. But as they climbed through 1,000 feet, the old demons returned. His hands began to shake slightly on the controls. His breathing became shallow. Images of the destroyed school in Afghanistan flashed through his mind, and suddenly, the peaceful training flight felt like a combat mission. "I need to land," Jake said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Not yet," Rodriguez replied calmly. "Keep flying. We're going to work through this." "I can't." "Yes, you can. You're already doing it. The airplane is flying straight and level. Your altitude is steady. Your heading is perfect. Whatever's happening in your head, your hands remember how to fly." Rodriguez was right. Despite the psychological turmoil, Jake's fundamental flying skills were intact. The aircraft was responding normally to his control inputs, maintaining the parameters Rodriguez had specified. "Now listen to me carefully," Rodriguez continued. "This isn't Afghanistan. There are no targets, no weapons, no life or death decisions. There's just you, me, and a simple airplane on a beautiful day. Look outside and tell me what you see." Jake forced himself to look out the windscreen. Below them, suburban Dallas stretched to the horizon, peaceful and ordinary. Other aircraft shared the airspace, their pilots conducting routine training flights and transportation missions. It was exactly what Rodriguez had said. A beautiful day for flying, nothing more dangerous than a weekend trip to visit relatives. "Better?" Rodriguez asked, after Jake's breathing had returned to normal. "A little. But what happens when I have to make decisions, when there are procedures to follow and systems to manage?" "Let's find out. Take us to 3,000 feet and turn north toward Lake Louisville." Jake climbed and turned, executing the maneuvers with the precision that had never left him. His hands were steady now, his confidence returning with each successful control input. They spent the next hour in the practice area, running through basic flight maneuvers that gradually became more complex: steep turns, slow flight, stalls, and recoveries. Jake's performance was rusty but fundamentally sound, like a musician returning to an instrument after a long absence. "One more test," Rodriguez said as they headed back toward Addison. "I want you to execute a short field approach to runway 33. Pretend there's an obstacle at the approach end, and you need to get down quickly." The scenario was designed to test Jake's ability to handle precision flying under pressure, exactly the kind of situation that had broken him in combat. Jake felt his anxiety spike again, but this time he pushed through it. He configured the aircraft for the approach, calculating the proper airspeed and descent rate. As they crossed the runway threshold, Jake chopped the power and flared precisely, touching down within the first 200 feet of available runway. "Outstanding," Rodriguez said as they taxied back to the ramp. "That was textbook precision flying." As Jake shut down the engine, he realized something had changed. The panic was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction that came from successfully completing a challenging flight. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like a pilot again. "So," Rodriguez said as they secured the aircraft, "do you think you can handle flying passengers from Dallas to Denver?" Jake looked at the Cessna, then at the other aircraft moving around the airport, then at the sky that had welcomed him back like an old friend. "Yes," he said. "I think I can." 6 months later, First Officer Jake Williams walked through Terminal C at Dallas International Airport in a pressed United Airlines uniform, rolling his flight bag toward Gate 22. The same gate where Captain Lisa Chen had first noticed his pilot wings tattoo, the same corridor where he'd spent 2 years pushing a mop cart. The transformation hadn't been easy. United's training program was intensive: ground school, simulator sessions, line training with experienced captains. There were moments when the old demons returned, when Jake found himself gripping the controls too tightly or second-guessing routine decisions. But each successful flight built confidence. Each safe landing proved that he could still be trusted with lives and aircraft. Captain Rodriguez had been right about one thing. Jake's combat experience, including the targeting error that had ended his military career, had made him a more careful pilot, not a more dangerous one. He approached every flight with the methodical precision of someone who understood that small mistakes could have large consequences. As Jake walked past the maintenance area, he saw his replacement, a new janitor, older than Jake had been, moving with the same quiet dignity that Jake remembered carrying during his darkest period. Jake nodded respectfully as he passed, recognizing something of himself in the man's careful invisibility. At Gate 22, Jake found Captain Chen completing her pre-flight paperwork. She looked up as he approached, and her face broke into a genuine smile. "First Officer Williams," she said formally, then grinned. "How does it feel to be back where you belong?" "Different," Jake admitted. "Better, but different." They walked together toward the aircraft, their conversation mixing professional flight planning with the easy camaraderie of pilots who shared more than just a profession. As they approached the Boeing 737, Jake felt the familiar surge of anticipation that came with the responsibility of flight. During the pre-flight inspection, Jake ran his hands along the aircraft's surfaces with the same care he'd once shown cleaning floors. But now he was checking for mechanical issues that could affect safety, not cleaning up spills that offended passengers. As they prepared for departure, Jake noticed a young girl in the first row, gripping her mother's hand with obvious anxiety. He recognized the fear immediately, the same terror he'd seen in Emma's eyes months earlier when he'd been nothing more than a janitor with a mop cart. "Ma'am," Jake said to the flight attendant, "would it be okay if I spoke to that little girl before takeoff? She looks nervous about flying." The flight attendant nodded, and Jake approached the family, his pilot's uniform lending authority to his reassuring words. He spent 5 minutes explaining how airplanes worked, describing the view from the cockpit, painting flight as an adventure rather than something to fear. By the time Jake returned to the cockpit, the little girl was pressing her face to the window, excited to see the world from 35,000 feet. "Old habits?" Captain Chen asked as Jake strapped into his seat. "Something like that," Jake replied. "Someone once told me that everyone you meet is carrying something you can't see. Sometimes a few kind words can make all the difference." As United Flight 1247 pushed back from Gate 22, Jake keyed the radio for his first departure from Dallas International as a commercial pilot. "Ground control, United 1247, ready to taxi with information Alpha. United 1247, taxi to runway 18 right via Alpha, Bravo." As they taxied toward the runway, Jake looked out at the terminal where he'd spent 2 years invisible to everyone who mattered. Now he was visible again, but in the right way. As a professional pilot responsible for the safety of 180 passengers who trusted him to deliver them safely to their destinations. The takeoff was smooth, the climb uneventful, the transition to cruise flight routine. But for Jake Williams, every mile they climbed away from Dallas International was a mile further from the man who'd believed his flying days were over, and a mile closer to the pilot he was meant to be. 3 hours later, as they descended toward Denver, the little girl who'd been afraid to fly pressed her small hand against the window and watched the city lights spread out below like a constellation fallen to earth. "Mom," she whispered loudly enough for Jake to hear, "when I grow up, I want to be a pilot just like him." Jake smiled as he configured the aircraft for landing. Some falls from grace, he realized, were just detours that led to where you were supposed to be all along. The important thing wasn't how far you fell. The important thing was remembering that the sky was always waiting for you to find your way back. And sometimes, all it took was someone who looked close enough to see the wings tattooed on your heart, even when they were hidden beneath coveralls and covered by shame. Years later, Captain Jake Williams would tell young pilots that the most important lesson he'd learned wasn't how to fly aircraft or navigate through storms. It was that dignity wasn't about the uniform you wore or the job you held. It was about how you treated people when you thought nobody was watching, and how you treated yourself when the whole world had given up on you. Some heroes wear wings on their chest, others carry them on their skin, invisible to those who don't know how to look. But the sky recognizes them all, and when they're ready to return, it welcomes them home with open arms and unlimited ceiling. The janitor with the pilot's tattoo had learned to fly again, not because someone rescued him, but because someone reminded him that he'd never really stopped being a pilot. He'd just forgotten how to see himself clearly, and sometimes that's all it takes to soar. This story was brought to you by Daily Soldier Stories. Have you ever met someone whose past was hidden beneath their present circumstances? Someone who carried dreams in their scars and hope in their silence? Share their story in the comments. And if this story reminded you that second chances are always possible, subscribe to support the channel. We're here to honor the journeys that lead us home to ourselves.